Today I have with me Seth Godin, author of over 12 best-selling books and one of the most prolific writers of our time and profound thinkers about all sorts of things. Seth, thanks for being with me today.
Well, thank you, Tom. I'm not sure I want to wear the prolific hat, but I'm happy to take all the other stuff. Thank you.
Okay. Today we're here to talk about your latest book, The Icarus Deception. And particularly, thanks for coming on to talk about it from a CIO and IT leadership perspective. There were many ideas in this book that resonated with me, and I want to explore that with you a little bit further. So one of the first things that you talk about in the book, or one of the big ideas you talk about in the book, is the shifting out of the industrial economy into something you call the connection economy. And I couldn't help but reflect on a couple of decades in the IT field and seeing some parallels. So, when I got into IT, it felt new, Wild West, exciting changes happening all the time. The PC revolution, the client-server revolution, the internet comes along. And each time, the response, it was exciting, but the response tended to be very similar. The objectives for IT were really to deliver something that's reliable, something that's stable, and the value proposition to the organization was largely about productivity and driving efficiency. And so we keep seeing profound changes, and we keep sort of responding in the same way, and that's worked really for a couple of decades, I'd say, pretty well. It does feel different this time around, and the way you articulate it in the book sort of resonated, so I was hoping you could maybe start there and talk to us about what you see in the shifting in the big picture.
Sure thing. I think I want to start by saying that the CIO guys, the IT guys at the top tend to be some of the smartest people I meet in organizations. But I also want to say that this industrialization of the role has been brought on largely by the CIOs themselves. And it's an output of a response to the way we've been raised since we were 5 years old, that the industrial economy created public school, and public school created legion of people who are raised and taught to fit in and be compliant and do what they're told. So what happened was the CIO role was created, and the CIO didn't walk in and say to the boss and say to the CEO, I want to do this, this might not work. They walked in and they said, I want to do this, this will work. And that choice turned the role from an opportunity to push the organization to the frontiers of using knowledge in new ways, to push the organization to one that would take innovation and data and cycle them one after the other, and moved it into an industrial entity that viewed the technology the way a factory uses the conveyor belt, right? Like, just make sure my Microsoft Word is up to date and working, go away, right? Because that's what CIO asked for. It was the comfortable place to be, and so it felt safe.
That leads me perfectly into the next idea I want to touch on in your book, which because you gave us a great framework, in my opinion, for thinking about this whole idea of the comfort zone and the safety zone largely matching in the way I described, and I think what you're saying resonates with me there. And what you're pointing out now is going forward is the safety zone is sort of shifted out from underneath the comfort zone. Maybe you could expound on that idea a little bit.
The way creatures evolve is really pretty simple. The ones that get killed don't have grandchildren, and so their habits go away. And we learn to avoid the things that are going to get us in trouble. We don't have time to do a careful analysis every time we have to think about crossing the street or raising our hand or having an interaction with some drunk guy at a bar, at a biker's bar. What we do is we say, does this make me feel comfortable? Because over time, the things that are safe are also the things that make us feel comfortable. So we end up living our lives in our comfort zone because it keeps us alive, it keeps us employed, it keeps us, engaged with people around us, which works fine until a revolution hits, and we have a revolution right now. So if we look at the record industry, the comfortable thing to do if you ran a record business, a music industry business, was sue the people who were copying things, avoid new formats like MP3, and try very hard to keep things the way they were because that's comfortable. But it turns out that wasn't safe. That was, in fact, a crazy, risky thing. That the safest thing to do would have been to take a leap and embrace a new environment. Well, the same thing goes on in the CIO. There's lots of things you can do every day that are comfortable and deniable and predictable and in your job description and that make the board and the CEO happy. And none of those things are actually safe anymore.
So how do we move beyond that? So we do have responsibilities. CIOs, IT leaders have responsibilities for keeping the lights on, running the shop, and we do have to deliver that as a large component of the work. How do we work with this idea of, doing things that might not work, and where do we start, and how do we get to where we're doing the bigger changes? Do we start small and go big later?
Well, certainly, but the realization is this. We now live in an era where if you can write down exactly what needs to be done, you can find someone cheaper to do it. And so if all you're doing all day is matching a written spec, then you are underemployed. And one day soon, you will be replaced. So I would just write down what needs to be done and outsource it or down scale the money you spend on it as fast as you can. And then use the rest of your time and the rest of your money to do stuff that can't be written down, to ask questions for which there are no answers, to create pockets of disruption that you are able to lead from, not manage from. And no, you can't do this big. You can't walk into a company with 10,000 employees and say, we're shifting what 1,500 of you do for a living, because that's way outside of everybody's comfort zone. Instead, what I'm talking about is small innovations, small wins. And when you look at an organization as cutting edge as Google, walking through their offices, you see all the usual IT department stuff, the 8.5 by 11 signs in the men's room, because that's the only place anyone will read them, telling people what they're supposed to be doing with this data group or that thing. And all of that stuff has to happen. I understand that. But what you also see are people who are in the deep end and who are playing with new ways for ideas to get exchanged. They're trying to, not just at Google, but at lots of places. What would happen if you led the team that eliminated email from your organization? Not made email work better, eliminated it and replaced it with some third-party service that was actually better. That would be a measurable impact on the productivity of your organization. Whereas keeping up the internal calendar system from 99.9% uptime to 99.95% uptime, hey, I can outsource that for $1.
Yeah, and that's definitely in the CIO circles I'm involved in. That's definitely the talk. That's definitely the trend, and that's where people are going. But it's helpful to have you articulate that in a little more detail. One of the other ideas I picked out of the book that I thought resonated for CIOs and IT leaders was this idea of domain knowledge. And you talk about the need for it, the importance for having it. And you also talk about how it's not enough. And domain knowledge is certainly home base for a lot of us in the IT field. And some ways that creates problems for us. So
Sure.
I'd love for you to talk about how that's required, but how we have to deliver more than that.
Well, the overriding art of the book is talking about art, not art like painting, but the art of being a human and doing work for the first time. And what artists do is they see an opportunity. So if we pick someone like Fred Wilson, the well-known venture capitalist in New York, Fred can look at a 2-page business plan and better than almost anybody say, this has got a shot or this doesn't. And he's right a lot. He's right with, at the Twitter level, at the Foursquare level. You make all these companies that he's invested in, and he hasn't invested in a lot of losers. So the question is, how does he know? How can he tell just from a couple pages and one lunch with a CEO? And the answer is domain knowledge. He's been doing it for 20 years. He's funded good companies. He's funded bad companies. He's seen what works and he sees what doesn't. And that knowledge of being able to see and see patterns is critical. And so when we talk about domain knowledge, the fact is, I don't care that you understand in third level what I can't even have the words for it, Linux versus this, that. It's irrelevant to me. You can hire out for that. What I want to know is, can you see patterns? Can you talk intelligently about your domain? Do you know, oh, when this person tried it, this worked, but when she tried it, it didn't, and here's the difference between the two. That's what domain knowledge is. In my talk, I have a slide of a conference that was held in Solvay in Europe in 1927 among physicists. And in that picture, 17 Nobel Prize winners in physics. But the fascinating thing is, at the time the picture was taken, most of them hadn't won the Nobel Prize yet. And so what that teaches us is that when we get together with other people who know how to see, we raise the bar for each other, and it helps us see further. And so, yeah, there's no room around the table for amateurs. Professionals around the table have to be doing more than housekeeping, because housekeeping is a waste of your time.
I like what you're talking about the Nobel Prize winners, because I'm very active in Society for Information Management, CIO, and IT leadership organization, and what a beautiful way to describe it. Getting together with other super smart, motivated people does raise the bar for everybody. I think that's a key value proposition, and thanks. I'm going to take that and I'm going to use that. One of the other things that strikes me in so much of your work is your ability to convey an idea. So you obviously have domain knowledge, but you're able to take it and bring such clarity, describe things in a concise and compelling manner. And that's something that IT leaders, CIOs need to do all the time. Get their ideas across, overcome sort of the curse of knowledge, and be able to step out of their shoes, but explain a big idea, sometimes a very complex idea, or based certainly on complex technologies and systems, in a very simple but compelling way. Can you share a little bit of your secret sauce with us?
Yeah, I'm not sure you're going to like the answer, though.
Okay.
The secret is you have to be willing to be completely rejected. When you simplify something and make it obvious what you're saying, then you're inviting people to say, I don't agree with you. You are wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. Whereas if you layer it with footnotes and proof and 3 more paragraphs and details and obfuscation, no one's going to say you're stupid, right? So it's the risk of being really clear. And when you think of the school crossing guard, there's no doubt about what the school crossing guard's job is. And no student has any confusion whatsoever about the difference between this and this, right? It's extremely simple. That works because yes or no, in or out, up or down. Whereas I started programming with an IBM 360 in 1976. And I remember the manual for the IBM 360. And basically what the manual was, look, if you have a question, it's because you're too stupid. Go away. It wasn't, here's the answer. It was so many pages, and the arrogant, this page intentionally left blank stuff. Because the people who wrote it, the entire culture of tech support has always been about functionality. It hasn't been about actually solving the problem. You know, if you discover a bug in some online service or some piece of software you are, getting the person on the other end of the phone when you finally get through 10 layers of tech support to say, yep, that's a bug, we made a mistake, is almost impossible. But it's that clarity of being able to look someone in the eye and be a human and say, I understand how frustrating this is. You could do this instead. When you do that, you're being clear, but you can also be rejected.
Yeah, I think you're striking a chord there, because I think many of us in the field really don't want to be wrong, and have been, as you talked about before, have been really trained, particularly in the IT field, where it was perceived as so risky, and one of the best things we could deliver was just making the stuff work. Back in the early days, just work, and downtime was bad. I remember in the early days, in my formative years, and maybe this is what sort of gets to the root of it, because for those of us that are in leadership positions now, this happened in our formative years. You know, when the thing went down, people literally left the building. You know, we weren't able to recover technically, organizationally.
Yep.
That had a profound impact on me, because, walking down the hall, I'm the guy who put everybody out of business. And there's other ways to look at it, and there's other ways to not buy into that. But at the surface level, we really don't want to be wrong a lot of the time.
No, that's exactly right. And now what I'm saying is, in most fields, the chances of it going down, the chances of the grocery store going down, the chances of my PC just bursting into flames are very low. But we still act like they're not. You know, like last year was the safest year for commercial aviation in the history of mankind. And yet, if you listen to the flight attendants practically screaming that we turn off our cell phones because we're 3 feet from the gate and superstition says that it might interfere with some magical piece of communication, they're still acting like their job is to keep the plane from bursting into flames. And I got to tell you, it's not going to burst into flames, and it's 1,000 times safer than any other way I could get there.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted to get back to the Icarus deception. What other, when you think of CIOs, IT leaders, I know you've founded a lot of businesses, you start a lot of projects, you're certainly working with folks in this realm. What else, what are the other lessons in here that you think might apply best to CIOs and IT leaders beyond what we've talked about already?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is this. I don't think of you as a CIO. I think of you as a person. And I don't think of your career as the job you do today. I think of your career as the sum total of contribution that you make over the course of your working life. And, during the industrial age, a 40-year arc of a career in a single position was pretty common. That's not true anymore. The organization that you work for creates value largely by the people it connects with, not by the factory it owns, because building a building, buying a machine, that's cheap. But building a connection and trust, that's priceless. And so what I would say to people who are unsuccessful in their career so far, or people who are successful in their career so far, is what next? How do you elevate your work to the point where you can say to people regularly, here, I made this. I made this. I went out on a limb and I made this thing, this interaction, this event, this, what do you think? And get into the habit of being rejected and failing and learning from that cycle. Because the minute you don't do that, the minute you say, I am a perfect producer of the same units I produced yesterday, but a little faster and a little cheaper, then you cease to be a person and you start to be a cog in a system. And I think you can do better than that.
That resonates, I think, in this field quite a bit because the average tenure for a CIO is something like 3.5 years. So it does, if you step back and look at the big picture, there's multiple ways to look at that. One way is that, you hit a wall and you move on and you go do the same thing someplace else. So the CIO has never had a very unusual for them to have an arc, in one company, for the 20, 30, 40 years. The average is something like 3.5. So I think that's great advice to help us start, thinking a little bit bigger, pushing ourselves a little harder. And I think that's another thing I wanted to point out about the book is there's a lot in here, a lot about leadership and a lot at a very personal level, which is really, I guess, we should get back to the title of the book. The Icarus Deception is based on the Greek myth. Icarus was, cautioned not to fly too high because if you got close to the sun, it would melt the wax that held his wings on. And I think, a lot of what we talked about today, that the fear of being wrong, the fear of failure, really sort of resonates, with that story.
Right, because the story used to be, until 1850, if you buy any old book of mythology, that Daedalus then said to Icarus, but son, more important, do not fly too low. Because if you fly too low, the mist and the water will weigh down your wings and you will surely perish. And my argument is we've been flying too low and we better fix it.
Great. Well, Seth, thanks again. Appreciate the conversation and thanks for your time.
A pleasure, Tom. Thanks for what you do. Appreciate it.